Some of you probably know, but I served on the Diocesan Commission on Ministry for 6 years. Paul served on it for a while. Pat Haug served on it for a while. I may be missing somebody. Other past clergy have also served on it. So what's important about that is that the Commission's task is to help discern whether an individual has a call to ordain ministry, and to ensure that, having discerned that call, they engage in a formation process which will prepare them spiritually and academically for ordained ministry. Deacon Stacy Sands went through that process, and Martha Camelli is nearing the end of her journey in that process. And there are other folks in this congregation who are somewhere along the way in this process. An ongoing task of the Commission is to discern in close collaboration with the bishop what the needs of the larger church are and are likely to be. The church I was ordained into in 1973 was very different from the church today. So as the Commission engages people who are discerning a call, it uses those emerging needs as a lens through which to see if the person has the vision and the gifts to serve in the church that is in the process of becoming. One emerging trend has been evident for some time. That is that there are going to be fewer and fewer full-time positions. Many parishes are lucky if they can afford one, and others can't afford even that. Now, we here are a bit removed from that reality, but it becomes readily apparent as one moves out into the more rural areas, especially in the eastern parts of the diocese. This is a huge challenge for this and other dioceses in terms of meeting the pastoral and sacramental needs of these congregations. And it's also a challenge for those seeking to serve as priests. Back in the day, we could all be reasonably assured that there would be full-time positions available and that they would continue to be available as our careers progressed. Not so today. So one way the Commission has been engaging those seeking to discern a call is to put that reality right up front and invite them to respond. We would tell them that they should understand that they will likely need to earn a living, or at least a good part of their living, in non-church employment. So how do they respond to that? Now, I say I found it pretty gratifying that most of the folks we met with had given that at least some thought. They were paying attention, and they didn't seem surprised by the question. And indeed, many of them had professional lives that would allow them to continue to make a living while serving parishes. Now, I imagine that this may be news to some of you. The church out there is changing in ways that you may not be aware of. The process of discernment and formation for the priesthood and the diaconate is changing as well, but you probably don't see it. It's a very challenging time for the church, and I believe an exciting time as well, because we are being afforded an opportunity to revise our own ideas of church and ministry, even in places like Christ Church Cathedral. So our lesson from Thessalonians this morning can be helpful to us. There are a couple of things at least to lift up here. One is Paul's clarity of his place in the community. He writes, "We were not idle when we were with you, and we did not eat anyone's bread without paying for it. But with toil and labor we worked night and day so that we might not burden any of you." Paul says that though he might have had the right to do things differently, he chose not to so that he could be an example to them. Meaning that from his perspective, everyone in the community would contribute to the well-being of that community, regardless of their station. Now, by the way, this is not the first mention of this practice. In Acts, Luke reports that Paul met up with a man named Aquila, who was of the same trade, and that is that they were tent makers. That's how they made their living. So Paul was a tent maker, and this trade has sometimes been used as a metaphor for self-sustaining ministry. Tent-making ministry is the phrase often used. And it's also important to note that Paul did not simply make tents in order just to make a living for himself. He used the income that he generated to contribute to the overall welfare of the community. He was in it with them. Having set this example, Paul then goes on to say something that might give us pause. I bet it got your attention. He goes on a mini rant about those who are living in idleness and, as Paul puts it, not according to the tradition that they received from us. He reminds them of the command that he had given them when he was there. Anyone unwilling to work should not eat. Did you get that when you heard the lesson? Okay then. Here's a statement that may resonate with a few of us, and it will probably appall a lot of us if we try to apply it too closely to our modern society. So some context may be helpful here. We need to remember that Paul was working tirelessly to establish new Christian communities and to help them thrive. This was really tough work and required his constant attention. He felt a real sense of urgency because these communities were trying to carve out a new way of living in the midst of a hostile environment. So for him, the idea that folks who claimed to be part of the community were not contributing to the overall well-being of that community was of great concern, since he knew that the community would suffer because of their idleness. So we ought not, let me be very clear about this, we ought not to take this quote from Paul as condemning those on welfare. In fact, we know early Christian communities were well known for their care for those who couldn't care for themselves. What Paul was about, I think, was creating communities grounded in the teachings of Jesus and also grounded in mutual care and accountability. If the church was to thrive and grow, everyone had to be all in. No sitting on the sidelines, not showing up every now and then, no showing up for meals when you haven't contributed to the welfare of all. If the community was going to thrive, if the good news was going to be proclaimed, then everyone bore equal responsibility to make that happen. So here we are, the family of Christ Church Cathedral, the spiritual, if not the literal, descendants of those who sought to be the body of Christ in a hostile world. Now, I'd say it would be easy for any of us to idealize those early communities and see in them the model for how we ought to be. It's also easy to find reasons why that would never work today, and some of them would be valid. We don't live in a small community in which we encounter each other on a daily basis. We don't have a shared economy where each person's contribution can easily be seen and measured. But equally importantly, especially thinking about the words of Paul, in this place, we will all be welcome to the table at all times. Everyone is welcome. But I want to get back to where I started, the idea that the church today will have to deal with the reality that many parishes cannot afford full-time clergy, and that clergy will increasingly need to be able to make at least part of their living in so-called secular jobs. What's that going to mean? What's that going to look like? So I've already talked about how the up-and-coming clergy are already looking to a vocation that will include tent-making ministry, serving 2 or 3 congregations. But what about the congregations themselves? I know that some parishes have embraced the concept of being yoked with others. Not all, however. There are places that continue to believe that they should be able to hire a full-time priest, and they have a real difficulty in moving into a future that does not look like the past. So Paul can be helpful here. One commentator noted that Paul's model is likely to become increasingly relevant in contexts where congregations can no longer afford full-time paid ministers, and sometimes it's appropriate even when they can. More about that later. What makes Paul's model work is that when he and his fellow apostles were gone, the community continued to function as the living, vital entity, carrying on Christ's work for themselves and others. And I think this happened for two reasons. One is that Paul did a really good job of preparing these communities for the work that was to be done, the work ahead. And the other is perhaps more important. These early Christians believed that the work of following Christ was so important that they devoted themselves to it both out of gratitude and out of a sense of urgency. So my sense of those churches that are thriving in this new model is that they have something of that in their own DNA. Now let's get back to the quote I cited earlier. The writer says that Paul's model can be appropriate even for those churches who can't afford one or more full-time clergy, like, say, Christ Church Cathedral. What's befalling other parishes can't happen here, you might say. Well, maybe not, at least maybe not in the foreseeable future, but let's do a little thought experiment. Imagine that the national economy really goes in the tank, and all our endowment is wiped out. All the clergy have to be let go. Since I'm retired, I'm able to stay on part-time to provide some Sunday coverage and pastoral care. Very self-serving, I understand that. So now what? I think, I've been here quite a while, and I think I know you well enough to believe that you all would step up and do what needed to be done. Some of you are already in leadership. Some of you are already involved in ministry, but I imagine others who haven't been would find your voice and offer your gifts. The work of ministry would get done, the good news proclaimed, and who knows what might emerge from this radical transition. But here's my challenge. Do we need to wait for a catastrophe to happen before new leadership emerges? Before new gifts are offered? Before new ministries are created? Who out there has an idea for doing something that will make a difference for the cathedral or the city or the diocese? Who's been wanting to take the lead in something that is waiting to be asked? And who's been sitting out there on Sundays, enjoying the liturgy, the music, maybe even the preaching, but wondering if there's more to church than that? Okay? Those are kind of semi-rhetorical questions, and I understand that. But Paul didn't need to ask those questions because he had a community that had been transformed by Jesus. And so do we.